Who did this to you? The words came out low, steady, almost gentle, strange, coming from a man built like a wall of leather and ink. Hannah Blake couldn't answer. She just knelt there in the rain, blood mixing with water on the gas station concrete, her whole body shaking too hard to speak. A massive biker from the Hells Angels had stopped his Harley beside her, and instead of walking past like everyone else in town always did, he knelt down too. Before we go any further, if you're watching this, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now subscribe because you don't want to miss what happens next. Let's begin. The rain came down sideways that night, slicing through the glow of the gas station sign like static on an old television. Hannah Blake didn't remember walking the last half mile. She didn't remember losing her shoes somewhere along Route 9, or how her cardigan had torn at the shoulder, or when exactly the blood from her split lip had started tasting like pennies in the back of her throat. She only remembered the moment her knees finally gave out, right there under the flickering fluorescent light of the Conoco sign, and the way the wet pavement felt like it was swallowing her whole. Behind her, the rumble of an engine cut through the storm. She didn't turn to look. She didn't have the strength to be afraid anymore. Fear required energy, and she had none left. Whatever was coming for her next, a car, a stranger, the end of everything, she was too tired to run from it. The engine slowed, then stopped. Boots hit the wet ground heavy and deliberate, and for a moment, Hannah squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for another voice she recognized, another laugh she'd learned to dread, another shove that would send her sprawling. Raven Hollow had taught her that kindness was rare and cruelty was reliable. She expected the second one. Instead, a shadow crouched down in front of her, and gloved hands moved with surprising care, tilting her chin up just enough to see her face in the gas station light. Cole Hunter had ridden through a lot of storms in his life. He'd seen a lot of things on the side of a lot of roads. But nothing prepared him for the sight of the 17-year-old girl folded up against a gas pump, like a piece of trash the world had decided to throw away, her face swollen on one side, her lips split open, one eye nearly shut with bruising that hadn't even finished blooming yet. He peeled off his gloves, dropped to one knee, and studied her for a long moment without saying a word. Behind him, the patch on his leather vest read, Hells Angels, Raven Hollow, Chapter Bakdun. But in that moment, none of that mattered. He wasn't a biker. He was just a man who couldn't look away from a child in that much pain. Hey, he said, voice low, careful, the kind of tone you'd use on a wounded animal that might still bolt. Hey, look at me. Can you hear me? Hannah's one good eye fluttered open. She flinched instinctively, drawing her arms up around herself. I'm not going to hurt you, Cole said. I promise you that. Nobody's going to touch you again tonight. You understand me? She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her jaw hurt too much to form words, and even if it hadn't, 17 years of learning not to trust anyone had built a wall in her chest that wasn't coming down for a stranger on a motorcycle, no matter how gentle his voice sounded. Cole took his jacket off, heavy leather still warm from his own body, and laid it gently over her shoulders. She flinched again at the contact, and he pulled his hands back immediately, giving her space, giving her time the way you'd approach something bald and frightened that had been hurt too many times before. Okay, he said softly. Okay, we're not in a hurry. Take your time. Take. The rain kept falling. Somewhere behind them, a car passed on the highway without slowing down. Nobody in this town ever slowed down for anything that wasn't their own business, and clearly a broken girl outside a gas station wasn't anybody's business tonight, except his. He looked at her again, really looked, and something in his chest went cold and tight all at once. He'd seen bruises like this before. He'd worn a few himself a long time ago, back when he was young and small and somebody bigger thought that made him fair game. He knew the shape of this kind of pain. He knew it wasn't an accident. He knew it wasn't a fall down the stairs, or a door that hit her wrong, or any of the excuses people use to protect the people who did this. Who did this to you? He asked again, quieter this time, like the question itself might break her if he said it too loud. Hannah's lips trembled. A tear slid down through the rain, already soaking her face, and for a moment she thought about lying. She thought about saying she fell, or that she didn't know, or any of the things she'd already practiced saying to the school nurse, to her mother, to herself in the mirror, at 3 a.m, when the bruises were the only thing looking back at her. But something about this man, the way he waited, the way he didn't rush her, the way his eyes didn't hold pity, but something closer to quiet fury on her behalf, made the wall in her chest crack just slightly, just enough. Ethan, she whispered. Ethan Grayson. Cole's jaw tightened. He didn't know the name yet, not really. Not what it meant in this town, not the weight it carried. But he filed it away like a man filing away a debt that would need collecting. Okay, he said. Okay, Hannah, that's your name, right, Hannah? She nodded barely. Hannah, I need you to stay with me. Can you do that? I'm going to get you somewhere warm, somewhere safe, and then we're going to figure out what happens next. Nobody is going to hurt you tonight. Not while I'm standing here. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly it physically hurt more than her ribs, more than her jaw, more than the ache behind her eyes. But belief was a luxury Raven Hollow had beaten out of her a long time ago. One incident at a time, one ignored complaint at a time, one silence from people who were supposed to protect her at a time. Still, when he offered his hand, she took it. It would be hours before Hannah told anyone the full story of what had happened that night. The diner, the humiliation, the moment everything in her carefully controlled life had cracked open. But to understand how a 17-year-old girl ended up bleeding on a gas station floor in the middle of a storm, you had to go back. You had to understand Raven Hollow, and you had to understand exactly what kind of town would let something like this happen in the first place. Raven Hollow was the kind of small Montana town where everyone knew everyone, where the high school football team was a local religion, and where the sheriff's family sat somewhere just below God in the unofficial hierarchy of who mattered and who didn't. Hannah Blake had never mattered, not in the way that counted in a town like this. She was quiet. She kept her head down. She worked the counter at her mother's diner after school, wiping tables and refilling coffee for truckers and old ranchers who barely looked up from their newspapers. She had two friends, if you could call them that, and a mother, Linda Blake, who worked harder than anyone Hannah had ever known, and still somehow couldn't make the numbers add up at the end of the month. Ethan Grayson, on the other hand, mattered enormously. He was the sheriff's son. Sheriff Victor Grayson had run Raven Hollow's police department for almost 20 years, and in that time he'd built something that looked like law enforcement, but functioned more like a personal kingdom. Ethan had grown up inside that kingdom, learning early that consequences were something that happened to other people. He was handsome in the way that small towns loved. Square jaw, easy smile, Letterman jacket, the kind of charm that made teachers overlook things and parents make excuses. And for reasons Hannah had never fully understood, he'd decided somewhere around freshman year that she was his favorite target. It started small, comments in the hallway, a shoulder check that was just hard enough to send her books scattering across the floor while he laughed with his friends and kept walking. Notes shoved into her locker with words that made her stomach twist. Nothing anyone could ever prove was intentional. Nothing that ever showed up on a security camera in a way that mattered. Nothing the school ever seemed interested in investigating. Not when the boy in question had a father who could make problems disappear with a single phone call. For 3 years, Hannah had learned to survive it the only way she knew how, by making herself as small and invisible as possible. Don't make eye contact. Don't react. Don't give him the satisfaction. Walk fast, keep your head down, and get through the day. It had almost worked, until the day Ethan and his friends walked into the diner. It was a Tuesday afternoon, slow. Like most weekdays, just a couple of ranchers finishing their coffee near the window and Linda in the back doing inventory. Hannah was behind the counter refilling the napkin dispensers when the bell above the door jingled and Ethan Grayson walked in with 3 of his friends already laughing about something already loud in the way that boys like him were always loud because the world had taught them their voices deserved the most space in any room. Well, look who it is, Ethan said, sliding into a booth with exaggerated ease. Didn't know they let you actually work here, Blake. Thought you just haunted the place. His friends laughed. Hannah kept her eyes on the napkin dispenser. 4 coffees, Ethan said. And don't spit in mine this time. I've never done that, Hannah said quietly, because it was true, and because some small, exhausted part of her still believed that facts mattered. Sure you haven't. Ethan grinned at his friends. She's probably too scared. Look at her. She's shaking, just standing there. She wasn't shaking. Not yet. But the comment landed anyway the way his comments always did, finding the exact soft place where it would hurt the most. Hannah brought the coffees. She set them down carefully one by one, trying to keep her hands steady, trying not to give him anything to laugh about. She almost made it. She was reaching to set the last cup down when Ethan shifted his leg at the exact wrong moment and the tray tipped and hot coffee splashed across his shirt and jeans. The diner went silent. Are you kidding me? Ethan shot to his feet, staring down at the stain spreading across his shirt. You did that on purpose. I didn't. Hannah started, already reaching for a towel, her heart slamming against her ribs. I'm so sorry. Let me get away from me. He shoved her hand away hard enough that she stumbled back into the counter. You know what? I'm done being nice about this. I've been nice for 3 years. You want to know why nobody in this town likes you, Blake? Because you're pathetic. Your mom's diner is a joke. Your dad left because he couldn't stand looking at either of you, and you walk around here like you're some kind of victim when really you're just... That's enough. The voice came from the back of the diner, and it wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a blade. Linda Blake stood in the doorway to the kitchen, flour still dusted on her apron, her eyes fixed on Ethan with an expression Hannah had rarely seen on her mother's face, pure, unfiltered fury. Get out of my diner, Linda said. Ethan turned, and for just a second, something like uncertainty flickered across his face. Then it hardened back into that easy, entitled smirk. You can't kick us out. My dad's the sheriff. I don't care if your dad is the president, Linda said, walking forward, planting herself between Ethan and her daughter. You do not speak to my daughter that way in my restaurant. You do not speak to her that way anywhere. Now get out and don't come back. For a long moment, nobody moved. Ethan's friends had stopped laughing. One of them, a lanky boy named Marcus, looked genuinely uncomfortable, glancing toward the door like he wanted to be anywhere else. Ethan's jaw tightened. You're going to regret this. Try me, Linda said. He left. The bell jingled violently as the door slammed shut behind him and his friends, and for a moment the diner exhaled collectively. The two ranchers by the window exchanging a wide-eyed glance before quietly returning to their coffee. Linda turned to Hannah, her fury melting instantly into concern. Baby, are you okay? Did he hurt you? I'm fine, Mom. Hannah's voice shook despite her best efforts. I'm fine. She wasn't fine. Some part of her deep down already knew that whatever had just happened in that diner wasn't over. Boys like Ethan Grayson didn't lose. They didn't get humiliated in public and simply move on. And boys like Ethan Grayson had fathers like Sheriff Victor Grayson, men who had spent 2 decades teaching this entire town that consequences were something you handed out, never something you received. That night, Hannah lay awake staring at her ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. The way her mother's voice had cracked like thunder. The way Ethan's face had twisted with something uglier than anger, humiliation. Real humiliation in front of his friends, in a town where his family's name was supposed to be untouchable. She should have been proud of her mother. Part of her was. But a colder, more familiar part of her, the part that had survived 3 years of Ethan Grayson's cruelty by staying small and invisible, knew exactly what was coming. It started 2 days later. Hannah walked out to the diner's small parking lot early Thursday morning to find every window on her mother's old sedan, smashed glass scattered across the asphalt like ice glittering under the gray morning light. Spray painted across the driver's side door in jagged red letters were words that made her stomach drop, "Watch yourself." She stood there for a long moment, coffee cup slipping from her fingers and shattering on the pavement before she found her voice enough to call for her mother. Linda came running out in her robe, and Hannah watched her mother's face go through disbelief, then horror, then that same hard fury from 2 nights ago, except this time it was tempered with something new fear. Call the police, Hannah said. Linda's hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone. I am. The deputy who arrived 20 minutes later, a heavy-set man named Dale Whitfield, who'd worked under Sheriff Grayson for 15 years, walked around the car, slowly taking notes with visible reluctance. Any idea who might have done this? He asked, not quite meeting Linda's eyes. I have a very good idea, Linda said. Ethan Grayson was in my diner 2 nights ago harassing my daughter. I asked him to leave. This happened 2 days later. I don't think that's a coincidence, Deputy. Dale's pen paused over his notepad. That's a serious accusation, ma'am. It's not an accusation, it's an observation. You can call it whatever makes you comfortable. Dale closed his notepad. I'll file a report, but without any actual evidence connecting the Grayson boy to this, there's not much we can do. Kids around here do dumb stuff on dares all the time. Could have been anybody. Linda's voice went cold. It wasn't anybody. It was targeted. My daughter has been bullied by that boy for 3 years, and now somebody vandalized my car 2 days after I asked him to leave my business. I want this investigated properly. Dale glanced toward the street, toward his patrol car, toward anywhere that wasn't Linda's furious eyes. I hear you. I'll pass it up the chain. They both knew exactly what passing it up the chain meant in a town where the chain led directly to Ethan's father. Nothing happened. No follow-up call. No further investigation. The report, if it existed at all, seemed to vanish into whatever black hole swallowed complaints that pointed toward the Grayson family in Raven Hollow. And that Hannah would later realize was the moment the entire town made its choice, not through some dramatic vote or public declaration, but through silence, through looking away, through deciding collectively and quietly that some families were simply too powerful to hold accountable, and some daughters simply weren't worth the trouble of protecting. The vandalism was just the beginning. Over the following 2 weeks, small cruelties accumulated like snowfall, each one small enough to dismiss on its own, each one part of a pattern too obvious to ignore. Someone left a dead crow on the diner's back step, its wings arranged in a way that felt deliberate, almost ceremonial in its cruelty. Linda found it before Hannah did and disposed of it quickly, but not quickly enough. Hannah had already seen it through the kitchen window, and the image burned itself into her mind for nights afterward. At school, someone started a rumor that Hannah had tried to seduce Ethan and gotten rejected, which somehow twisted itself into an even uglier story by the time it reached its third or fourth retelling. Girls she barely knew started whispering when she walked past. Someone scrawled something crude about her on the bathroom wall. When she reported it to the school counselor, a tired woman named Mrs. Fenwick, who genuinely seemed to want to help, but had no real power to do so, the response was sympathetic but hollow. I'll speak to the principal, Mrs. Fenwick said. But Hannah, I want you to understand something. The Grayson family has been very generous to this school. There's sensitivity around anything involving that family. I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying I want you to be prepared for how slowly this might move. He's the one hurting me, Hannah said, her voice breaking despite her best efforts to keep it steady. Why does it matter whose family he's from? Mrs. Fenwick's eyes softened with something that looked almost like shame. It shouldn't matter. I know it shouldn't. I'm sorry, Hannah. I really am. Sorry didn't fix anything. Sorry didn't stop the whispers or the note that appeared in her locker reading, "You and your mom should leave town," or the brick that came through the Blake family's living room window on a Saturday night, while Hannah and her mother were watching television, shattering glass across the carpet just feet from where Hannah had been sitting seconds before. Linda called the police again. Dale Whitfield came again, took another report, offered the same helpless shrug. I'll pass it up the chain, he said again. And this time Linda didn't even bother arguing. She just stood in her living room, staring at the glass scattered across her carpet at the brick lying near the couch with a note rubber banded to it that read simply, "Last warning." We need to leave, Linda said quietly that night after Hannah had swept up the last of the glass. Hannah, I think we need to leave this town. And go where Mom, Hannah's voice cracked. With what money you've put everything into that diner. We can't just run. I don't care about the diner if something happens to you. Nothing's going to happen to me. Hannah didn't believe her own words even as she said them, but she needed her mother to believe them, needed at least one of them to hold on to some fragile hope that things wouldn't get worse. They got worse. The social media post started a week later. Fake accounts untraceable posting doctored photos of Hannah with cruel captions tagging half the school so the humiliation would spread as fast and as far as possible. Hannah watched the comments pile up under her own photo, strangers and classmates alike, piling cruelty onto cruelty, and she felt something inside her start to crack in a way that had nothing to do with bruises or broken glass. She stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria. She started taking the long way around the school to avoid certain hallways. She stopped looking at her phone because every notification felt like a small blade waiting to cut her. She watched her mother age years in weeks, dark circles deepening. Under her eyes, the diner's evening customers thinning out as rumors and pressure from unknown sources made regulars quietly disappear. Raven Hollow wasn't just watching Hannah suffer. Raven Hollow was participating in it. One silence at a time, one averted gaze at a time, one report that vanished into nothing at a time. And Sheriff Victor Grayson, sitting behind his desk at the station with his son's humiliation still fresh in his mind, had made his own quiet decision about how far this was going to go, a decision Hannah wouldn't fully understand the shape of until it was almost too late. The night everything finally broke started like any other. Hannah had closed the diner alone, Linda had gone to the bank to plead for an extension on their loan, something she'd been doing more and more often as the diner's revenue kept shrinking under the weight of the town's collective cold shoulder. Hannah locked up around 9, the streets quiet, the rain just beginning to fall in that thin, cold way that Montana nights sometimes had a warning of something heavier to come. She was halfway across the parking lot when she heard the voices. There she is. Ethan stepped out from behind a parked truck, and this time he wasn't alone. 3 friends flanked him, and something about their energy was different from the usual mocking cruelty. It was sharper, angrier, like the humiliation from the diner had been simmering for weeks and had finally reached a full dangerous boil. "Ethan, please," Hannah said, backing up, her keys clutched tight in her fist. "Just leave me alone. I don't want any trouble." "You should have thought about that before you humiliated me in front of everyone," Ethan said, stepping closer. "You and your mom think you're better than us. You think you can just embarrass me and there's no consequences. I didn't do anything. You spilled coffee on me on purpose. It was an accident. Everything's always an accident with you people, isn't it?" The rain thickened. Hannah's back hit the side of her mother's replacement car, an old dented thing they'd bought used after the vandalism, and she realized with a cold, sinking dread that she had nowhere left to go. "Ethan, please," she whispered, and for the first time, real fear cracked through her voice, the kind of fear that came from finally understanding that this wasn't going to end with words. What happened next happened fast, a shove that sent her stumbling into the wet pavement, a voice snapping something cruel, a fist that connected before she even understood it was coming, and then the world became a blur of pain and rain, and the taste of blood, and the sound of laughter that somehow felt worse than any of it. She didn't remember every detail afterward, not clearly, not in order. She remembered hitting the ground. She remembered someone's boot. She remembered a voice, not Ethan's, saying, "That's enough, let's go," and the sound of footsteps retreating, and then silence except for the rain and her own ragged breathing. She lay there for a long time before she found the strength to move. She didn't go home. She didn't know why exactly. Maybe some instinct told her that home wasn't safe either, that whatever this was had grown too large for 4 walls to protect her from. She just started walking barefoot somewhere along the way, her shoes lost in the chaos, walking without direction, without thought, just moving, because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. She did not know how long she walked before her legs simply stopped working, before her body finally gave out at the edge of a gas station parking lot on Route 9, it collapsing onto wet concrete under a flickering fluorescent sign. She didn't know, kneeling there in the rain with blood on her lip and her whole world falling apart, that the sound of an approaching engine wasn't another threat. She didn't know that the man climbing off that motorcycle, a stranger in leather with Hell's Angels stitched across his back, was about to become the first person in 3 years who looked at her and refused to look away. Cole helped her to her feet slowly, one arm wrapped carefully around her shoulders, careful not to press against the ribs that were clearly bruised beneath her soaked cardigan. His motorcycle sat idling nearby, and for a moment Hannah simply stood there, shivering under his jacket, staring at him like she wasn't entirely sure he was real. "I've got you," Cole said quietly. "You're safe now. I need you to trust me for just a little while, okay? Can you do that?" Hannah thought about all the times in the last 3 years she'd trusted someone to help her: teachers, deputies, classmates, even her own instincts about what this town was capable of, and how every single time that trust had led nowhere. She thought about her mother's exhausted face, about the brick through their window, about Ethan's laughter echoing in her ears even now. And yet, standing there in the rain, wrapped in a stranger's jacket, something in her chest, some small, stubborn, nearly extinguished part of her, decided to try one more time. "Okay," she whispered. Cole nodded, something hardening behind his eyes, something that looked less like anger and more like resolve, the quiet, dangerous resolve of a man who had just decided without a shred of doubt that whatever was happening to this girl was about to stop. He pulled out his phone and made a call, his voice low and steady. "Marcus, it's Cole. I need you to get the guys together. We've got a situation in town and it's bad, really bad." He glanced down at Hannah, at her trembling shoulders, at the fresh bruises already darkening beneath the gas station light, and something in his expression made a silent promise that he had no intention of breaking. "Trust me," he said, again softer this time. "This isn't over, but it's not going to keep happening to you. Not anymore." For the first time in longer than she could remember, Hannah allowed herself to believe just slightly that someone meant those words. She didn't know yet what those words would cost. She didn't know how deep the corruption in Ravenhollow actually ran, or how far Sheriff Victor Grayson would go to protect his son and his kingdom, or how many people in this town would have to choose a side before the truth finally clawed its way into the light. She only knew that for the first time in 3 years, standing in the rain with a stranger's jacket around her shoulders, she wasn't alone. And somewhere behind them, in a house on the good side of town, Sheriff Victor Grayson stared at his son's split knuckles and asked only one question in a voice utterly devoid of concern for anyone but his own family's name. "Did anyone see you, Ethan hesitated, wiping blood from his hand with a towel his father had handed him without a flicker of alarm. "I don't think so." Victor nodded slowly, already reaching for his phone, already beginning to construct the version of events that would protect his son from consequences, the same way he'd protected him for 17 years. "Good," he said, "then this never happened." But it had happened, and somewhere across town, a girl who refused to disappear was about to become the reason his carefully built kingdom started for the first time in 2 decades to crack. Cole didn't take her home right away. He knew better than that. A girl beaten this badly needed a doctor before she needed her mother's tears, and he needed time to think before he did something he couldn't take back. He lifted her onto the back of his Harley with more gentleness than his enormous hands looked capable of, wrapped his jacket tighter around her shoulders, and told her to hold on. "Where are we going?" Hannah asked, her voice raw and small against the rain. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere they've got a doctor who doesn't ask questions he doesn't need to ask." She didn't argue. She didn't have the strength to argue, and some quiet, desperate part of her had already decided that whatever waited at the end of this ride couldn't possibly be worse than what she was leaving behind. The clubhouse sat on the edge of town, a converted warehouse with motorcycles lined up outside like sentries, dim orange light spilling from windows that had been painted over decades ago. Cole eased the bike to a stop and helped her down carefully, one arm bracing her weight as her knees threatened to buckle again. Inside, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and kind, tired eyes rushed forward the moment she saw them. "Cole, what happened?" She stopped short, her gaze landing on Hannah's face, and her expression shifted instantly from question to action. "Get her to the back room. Now." "Doreen's a nurse," Cole explained quietly, guiding Hannah forward. "Retired. She patches us up when we're too stubborn to go to a hospital. She'll take care of you." Doreen examined Hannah with careful, practiced hands, checking her ribs, her jaw, the swelling around her eye, murmuring reassurances the whole time in a voice that reminded Hannah achingly of what a grandmother's voice might sound like if she'd ever had one. "Cracked rib, maybe too," Doreen said, finally glancing up at Cole, who stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his jaw set like stone. "Nothing that needs surgery, but she needs rest, and she needs to be seen by an actual doctor tomorrow to make sure there's no internal bleeding. Whoever did this hit her hard enough to know what they were doing." "He's 17, Hannah whispered. "He's not some professional. He's just cruel." Doreen's hands paused. 17. Hannah nodded and something in the room changed. Doreen looked up at Cole and the two of them exchanged a glance, heavy with unspoken fury, the kind of look adults share when a child has just confirmed something they were desperately hoping wasn't true. "Cole," Doreen said quietly, "you need to call her mother." "I'm calling her now," Hannah's head snapped up. "Wait, please, not yet. She's going to panic. She's already so stressed about the diner, about everything. I can't." "Hannah." Cole crouched down in front of her, his voice steady but firm. "Your mother is going to panic a lot more if she comes home and you're not there. Trust me on this one. Mothers always find out. The only question is whether they find out from you or from a stranger or from a hospital calling to tell her you're in a bed she didn't know about." Hannah's eyes filled with tears, the first she'd allowed herself since collapsing at the gas station. "She's going to blame herself." "She's not going to blame herself," Cole said. "She's going to blame whoever did this to you, as she should." He stepped outside to make the call, and through the thin wall Hannah could hear fragments of his voice, calm, careful, deliberately, unhurried, the voice of a man who had clearly delivered hard news to frightened parents before and knew exactly how to keep panic from turning into hysteria. Linda arrived 20 minutes later, and the sound she made when she saw her daughter's face was a sound Hannah knew she would remember for the rest of her life, something between a sob and a scream, cut short by her own hand flying to her mouth as she rushed across the room. Baby. Linda's hands hovered over Hannah's face, afraid to touch, afraid not to. Oh my God, baby, what happened? Who did this? It was Ethan, Hannah said, and saying it out loud to her mother finally after 3 years of minimizing and hiding and pretending it wasn't as bad as it was, broke something loose in her chest. It was Ethan and his friends, in the parking lot, after I closed up. Linda's whole body went rigid. When she turned to look at Cole, her eyes were burning with a fury so absolute it seemed to steady her shaking hands. The sheriff's son did this. That's what she's telling me, Cole said. Then I'm calling the police. Ma'am. Cole's voice was gentle but carried an edge of something harder underneath. I don't think you understand who you'd be calling. I understand exactly who I'd be calling, Linda snapped, though her voice cracked on the last word. I've been calling them for weeks. Vandalism threats a brick through my living room window every single time nothing happens. Every single time. And now my daughter is sitting here with a cracked rib because I trusted that eventually someone in that department would actually do their job. The room went quiet. Doreen busied herself with cleaning up supplies, giving the family space, but Cole didn't look away. Mrs. Blake, he said carefully, I'm not telling you not to call the police. I'm telling you that in my experience, when the people responsible for enforcing the law are protecting the people breaking it, calling that same department rarely fixes anything. It usually just tells them how much you know and how much they need to bury. Linda's jaw trembled. Then what am I supposed to do? Just let this go. Let him get away with it. Look at her face. I'm not saying let it go. Cole's voice hardened just slightly, just enough to reveal the steel underneath the calm. I'm saying there's a smarter way to fight this than walking into a police station run by the boy's father and hoping for justice that clearly hasn't come in weeks of trying. You need evidence. You need witnesses who will actually talk, and you need people standing behind you who aren't afraid of Victor Grayson. And I suppose you're volunteering, Linda said, though the edge in her voice had softened just slightly into something closer to desperate hope. I am, Cole said simply. My club doesn't let things like this slide. Not when it's a kid. Not when it's this bad. Linda studied him for a long moment. The leather vest, the patches, the tattoos climbing up his forearms, everything her whole life had taught her to be wary of, and then looked at her daughter's battered face and made a decision that would change everything. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, tell me what you need from me. That night, Hannah slept in the clubhouse's small guest room under thick blankets that smelled like cedar and motor oil. Her mother curled in a chair beside the bed, refusing to leave, even when Doreen offered her a real bed down the hall. Outside, low voices carried through the walls, Cole and several other members of his chapter, discussing something in tones too quiet for Hannah to fully make out, though she caught fragments. Names, dates, the word sheriff said with disgust. She didn't know it yet, but that conversation was the beginning of a war that would consume the entire town. 3 miles away in a house with manicured lawns and a flagpole out front, Sheriff Victor Grayson sat at his kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey he'd barely touched, staring at his son across the room. Sit down, Victor said. Ethan sat his knuckles still raw, his eyes refusing to meet his father's. Tell me exactly what happened. Every detail. And don't you dare lie to me because I will find out the truth one way or another, and I'd rather hear it from you than from some deputy's report. Ethan's story came out in halting pieces, the parking lot, the shove, the punch that had connected harder than he intended, the way Hannah had crumpled and hadn't gotten back up right away, the way his friends had finally pulled him back and told him it was enough. Victor listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. And when Ethan finished, he simply nodded once slowly like a man calculating numbers in his head. Did anyone see you leave the scene? I don't think so. Think Ethan. This isn't a question you get to guess on. No, nobody saw us. It was raining. The lot was empty. Victor exhaled slowly. Good. Then here's what happens next. You didn't touch that girl. You were home all night. If your friends say anything different, you remind them what happens to people who cross this family. Do you understand me? Ethan finally looked up, something flickering behind his eyes that might have been the last remnant of a conscience quickly smothered under years of learning that his father's approval mattered more than anyone else's pain. Dad, she was really hurt. I don't care what you think you did. Victor snapped, his voice sharp enough to make Ethan flinch. I care about what can be proven, and nothing can be proven if nobody talks. This ends here, tonight. This never happened. But Victor Grayson, for all his careful control over 2 decades of small-town power, had made one critical miscalculation. He assumed, as he always had, that fear and silence would be enough to make the problem disappear the same way it always had before. He had no idea that the girl his son had beaten in a parking lot was at that very moment sleeping under the protection of 8 Hells Angels who had absolutely no intention of staying quiet. The next morning, Cole called a meeting at the clubhouse. 11 members sat around a long table, coffee cups and cigarette smoke filling the room while Cole laid out everything Hannah and Linda had told him: 3 years of bullying, the diner incident, the vandalism, the dead crow, the brick through the window, and now an assault severe enough to crack ribs. "This isn't a bar fight or a debt collection," said a heavy-set man named Big Russ, arms crossed, expression grim. "This is a 17-year-old girl, and it sounds like the sheriff's covering for his own kid." "That's exactly what it is," Cole said. "So what's the play?" asked another member, a wiry man everyone called Preacher, despite having never set foot in a church in his adult life. "We can't exactly ride up to the police station and demand justice. That's not how this works, and you know it." "No," Cole agreed, "but we can make sure nothing else happens to that family while we figure out how to actually get justice. We put eyes on the diner. We put eyes on their house. We make sure everyone in this town knows that girl isn't alone anymore. And if Grayson wants to keep pretending nothing happened, he's going to have to explain why 5 Harleys are parked outside her house every night." Big Russ nodded slowly. "And the evidence? That's the harder part," Cole admitted. "No witnesses who will talk. No security cameras in that parking lot. Just her word against a sheriff's kid with 3 friends backing whatever story his father tells him to say." "Then we need someone who isn't afraid of Grayson to start digging," Preacher said. "Someone who can actually do something with whatever we find." Cole nodded slowly, an idea already forming. "I know someone. Journalist. Used to work for a paper in Billings before it folded. She's been sniffing around this county for a year looking for exactly this kind of story." "Patricia Reeves. You trust her?" "I trust that she hates corrupt cops more than she's afraid of getting on their bad side," Cole said. "That's good enough for me." That afternoon, while the club began organizing patrols around the Blake Diner and residence, Hannah sat in Doreen's kitchen, picking at a bowl of soup that she didn't have the appetite to finish. Her ribs ached with every breath, and the bruise around her eye had darkened overnight into something almost purple-black. But for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was waiting for the next terrible thing to happen. "You don't have to eat if you're not hungry," Doreen said gently, sitting across from her. "But you should try. Your body needs it to heal." "Thank you," Hannah said quietly, "for everything. I don't even know how to—" "You don't need to thank me, sweetheart." Doreen reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "What happened to you was never okay. Not for one single day of those 3 years. I'm just sorry it took this long for someone to actually step in." Hannah's eyes stung. "Why do you think he did it, Cole? I mean, why does he even care? He doesn't know me." Doreen was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Cole's had a hard life before the club, before any of this. I won't tell his story for him because it's his to tell if he ever wants to. But I'll tell you this, he knows what it's like to be a kid nobody protected. And he made a promise to himself a long time ago that if he ever had the power to stop that from happening to someone else, he would, every single time." Before Hannah could respond, the door burst open and Cole stepped in, his expression tight with barely controlled anger, phone still in his hand. "They burned it," he said. Hannah's stomach dropped. "Burned what?" "The diner. Someone set a fire behind the kitchen an hour ago. Fire department's there now. Your mom's on her way." Hannah was on her feet before her ribs could remind her how badly that decision hurt, gasping through the pain as she grabbed for her jacket. "I need to see it. I need to see her." "I'll drive you," Cole said. "But Hannah, listen to me. This is going to look bad. I need you to stay calm when we get there, because there's going to be police and there's going to be a lot of eyes on you, and I don't want anyone twisting your reaction into something it isn't." The drive felt like it took an hour, though it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. When they pulled up outside the diner, smoke was still curling from a blackened section of the roof near the kitchen, firefighters coiling hoses while a small crowd of onlookers gathered at a safe distance, whispering behind their hands. Linda stood at the edge of the parking lot, her hands pressed over her mouth, tears streaming silently down her face as she stared at the damage. Hannah ran to her the moment Cole's bike stopped, wrapping her arms around her mother despite the protest of her ribs. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." "This isn't your fault," Linda said fiercely, holding her daughter tight. "Do you hear me? None of this is your fault. This is on them. All of them." Deputy Dale Whitfield stood near the fire truck, clipboard in hand, looking distinctly uncomfortable as he approached. "Mrs. Blake, I'm sorry about your restaurant. Fire marshal thinks it might have started from faulty wiring near the back." "Faulty wiring," Linda repeated flatly. "You're going to stand there and tell me faulty wiring caused a fire 2 days after my daughter was assaulted by the sheriff's son?" Dale's eyes flicked nervously toward the crowd, toward the sheriff's cruiser that had just pulled up at the edge of the lot. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but until the fire marshal's full report comes back, we can't just assume." "You can't assume." Linda's voice rose sharp enough to cut through the murmur of the crowd. "You couldn't assume when my car was vandalized. You couldn't assume when a brick came through my window. Now my business is on fire, and you still can't assume anything. When exactly does something become obvious enough for this department to actually do its job?" Sheriff Victor Grayson stepped out of his cruiser, adjusting his hat, with the unbothered calm of a man who had spent 20 years believing himself untouchable. He walked over with measured, unhurried steps, his expression arranged into something that almost passed for sympathy. "Linda," he said, "terrible thing, a fire like this. Insurance should cover most of it, I'd imagine." "Don't you dare," Linda said, her voice trembling with fury. "Don't you dare stand here and act like you don't know exactly why this happened." "I have no idea what you're implying," Victor said smoothly, though something flickered behind his eyes when his gaze landed on Hannah's bruised face, a flicker of calculation rather than concern. "What happened to your daughter's face, by the way? That looks nasty." "You know exactly what happened to her face," Hannah said, stepping forward despite her mother's restraining hand. "Your son did this to me in the parking lot last night." The crowd's murmuring sharpened into something more attentive. Victor's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold and flat. "That's a very serious accusation, young lady. Do you have any proof of that? Any witnesses?" "You know there weren't any witnesses," Hannah said, her voice shaking but refusing to break. "It was raining, it was dark. Just like every other time, nobody happens to see what he does." "I understand you're going through something difficult," Victor said, his voice taking on a patronizing gentleness that made Hannah's skin crawl. "But my son was home all night. Several people can confirm that. I'd be careful about the kind of accusations you make against a minor, especially without evidence. That's the sort of thing that can follow a young person around." The threat, thinly veiled behind pleasant words, landed exactly as intended. Linda's face went white with rage. "Are you threatening my daughter?" "I'm simply advising caution," Victor said, "for everyone's sake." Cole, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the conversation, finally stepped forward, his presence alone enough to make several onlookers take an involuntary step back. "Sheriff," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "I found this girl on the side of the road last night, beaten badly enough to crack ribs. Her injuries are documented. There's a nurse who examined her within hours of the assault. If your son had nothing to do with it, I'm sure a real investigation would clear him easily enough. Unless there's a reason you're so eager to avoid one." Victor's jaw tightened as he took in Cole's vest. The patch on his chest, the small crowd of bikers who had begun gathering near the diner's edge, watching the exchange with unmistakable hostility. "And who exactly are you?" Victor asked. "Cole Hunter, Hell's Angels Raven Hollow chapter. And I'll be honest with you, Sheriff, my club doesn't take kindly to grown men protecting other grown men who hurt kids. Doesn't matter whose son he is." The air between them went tight and dangerous, the kind of silence that precedes something breaking. Victor's hand drifted almost imperceptibly toward his belt before he seemed to catch himself straightening instead with forced composure. "I'd be careful," Victor said quietly, "about threatening a sheriff in front of witnesses." "That wasn't a threat," Cole said. "That was a promise. There's a difference. A threat is something you might not follow through on." For a long, taut moment, nobody spoke. Then Victor turned on his heel, motioning for Dale to finish up his notes and walk back toward his cruiser without another word, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed exactly how rattled he actually was. Linda watched him go, her whole body trembling with adrenaline and fear, and something that might have finally been hope. "He's not going to let this go," she said quietly. "Not after this." No, Cole agreed. He's not, which means we need to move faster than he does. That evening, as firefighters finished clearing the scene and the crowd finally dispersed, Cole placed a call to Patricia Reeves. She agreed to meet the following morning, intrigued enough by his description of the situation to set aside whatever else she'd been working on. But that night, back at the clubhouse, an unexpected visitor arrived at the door, one of Ethan's friends, the lanky boy named Marcus, who had looked uncomfortable during the diner confrontation weeks earlier. He stood at the entrance, shifting nervously, clearly having debated the decision to come the entire drive over. "I need to talk to someone," Marcus said when Cole answered the door. "About what happened last night. I was there." Cole's expression sharpened instantly. "Come in." Marcus sat across from Cole and Linda in the clubhouse's main room, his hands twisting together in his lap, unable to meet anyone's eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. "I didn't touch her," he said quickly. "I want that clear. I didn't hit her. But I was there. Tyler and Josh, too. Ethan he lost it. I've never seen him like that. I tried to pull him off her and he wouldn't stop. And by the time we finally got him to back off, she was just lying there, and we panicked and left." Linda's hands clenched into fists on the table. "You left her lying on the ground in the rain." Marcus flinched. I know how that sounds. I've felt sick about it all day. That's why I'm here." "Will you say that in an official statement?" Cole asked. "To a lawyer or to Patricia Reeves, the journalist looking into this?" Marcus hesitated, fear flickering plainly across his face. "If I do that, Sheriff Grayson will destroy me. My family, my dad's business, all of it. He's done it before to people who cross him. And if you don't," Cole said quietly, "that girl in the next room over there is going to keep being the only one telling the truth against the sheriff's son and his father's entire department. You have a chance to change that. I understand you're scared, but I need you to understand what silence costs too." Marcus sat in agonized silence for a long moment before finally nodding jaw tight. Okay, I'll talk to her, the journalist, but not here, somewhere private. If anyone sees me coming in and out of a Hells Angels clubhouse, that's its own kind of trouble." "We'll arrange it," Cole said. "Thank you, Marcus. This matters more than you know." After Marcus left, Linda turned to Cole with something like disbelief written across her exhausted face. "We might actually have a witness." "We might," Cole said carefully. "But witnesses can get scared. People can change their minds when the pressure gets heavy enough. And believe me, Grayson's going to bring plenty of pressure once he realizes his own son's friend might turn on him. We need more than one thread. We need Patricia digging into everything, the vandalism, the fire, whatever pattern of corruption got this department to ignore 3 years of complaints in the first place." The following morning, Patricia Reeves arrived at the clubhouse in a beat-up Subaru, loaded with camera equipment, in a look of sharp, hungry curiosity in her eyes. She was in her 40s, sharp-featured with the exhausted energy of someone who'd spent years chasing stories nobody wanted printed. "Cole Hunter," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "You said this was big. I've heard that before and been disappointed plenty of times." "You won't be disappointed this time," Cole said, leading her inside. Hannah told her story again, slower this time, more detailed, walking Patricia through 3 years of escalating cruelty, while Patricia's pen moved rapidly across her notepad, occasionally pausing to ask sharp-pointed questions that revealed a journalist who knew exactly what kind of holes a defense attorney would try to poke in this story later. "The fire," Patricia said, looking up from her notes. "Has the fire marshal's report come back yet?" "Not yet," Linda said. "I have a contact at the county fire office," Patricia said. "I'll see what I can find out unofficially. Faulty wiring stories have a funny way of collapsing under real scrutiny." She turned back to Hannah. "I need you to understand something before we go any further. If we do this, if we actually publish this story, it's going to get ugly. Grayson's not going to sit quietly while his kingdom gets exposed. He's going to fight back, and he's going to fight dirty. Are you prepared for that?" Hannah thought about 3 years of silence, 3 years of small cruelties compounding into something that had nearly broken her entirely, 3 years of watching adults who should have protected her look away instead. "I've been living in ugly for 3 years, Hannah said quietly. "At least this way, it might actually mean something." Patricia nodded slowly, something like respect flickering across her sharp features. "All right, let's build this case properly then. I want documentation of everything, every complaint you filed, every date, every incident. I want photos of your injuries, time-stamped. I want that witness statement from your friend Marcus, if he's willing. And I want to talk to your deputy, the one who kept telling you he'd pass it up the chain. Something tells me he's not as loyal to Grayson as he's had to pretend to be. Over the following days, the investigation began taking shape piece by careful piece. Patricia met privately with Marcus, who nervously but firmly corroborated Hannah's account of the parking lot assault. She tracked down the fire marshal's preliminary findings, which noted buried in bureaucratic language that the fire's point of origin showed signs inconsistent with simple electrical failure signs, in fact consistent with accelerant. And then in a development nobody had anticipated, Deputy Dale Whitfield showed up at the clubhouse, late one night alone, out of uniform, looking like a man who hadn't slept properly in days. "I need to talk to someone," he said when Cole opened the door, "before I lose the nerve to do it." Inside, Dale sat across from Cole and Patricia, his hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. "I've worked under Victor Grayson for 15 years, he began. "I've looked the other way more times than I can count. Small things mostly, speeding tickets that disappeared for the right people, complaints that got buried. I told myself it wasn't my job to rock the boat, that I was just following orders, that it wasn't really my responsibility." He looked up and his eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted. "But that girl's face, I keep seeing it every time I close my eyes. And I know that fire wasn't an accident. I overheard Victor on the phone the night before it happened, talking to someone about sending a message to the Blakes. I didn't think much of it at the time. I should have." "Will you testify to that?" Patricia asked, her pen already moving. Dale's jaw tightened. "If I do that, my career is over. My pension, everything I've worked for. Victor will make sure of it one way or another." "And if you don't," Cole said quietly, "how many more girls do you think end up exactly where Hannah did? How many more fires? How many more bricks through windows?" Dale was silent for a long time, staring down at his untouched coffee. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "I'll testify. Not because I'm brave, because I'm done being a coward." As the pieces of the case slowly assembled themselves, Marcus's account, Dale's testimony, the fire marshal's suspicious findings, Hannah's documented injuries, Cole knew they were building something powerful enough to actually shake Victor Grayson's kingdom for the first time in 2 decades. But he also knew with the certainty of a man who understood exactly how far cornered animals would go to survive that Victor wouldn't simply wait around to be exposed. 3 nights later, Cole's phone rang at nearly midnight. It was Big Russ, his voice tight with urgency. "Cole, you need to get to the diner now." "What's happening?" "Someone's out there right now. Looks like they're trying to break into the back office. I think they're after something." Cole was already grabbing his keys, adrenaline spiking through his chest. "Don't approach alone. Wait for me." He arrived at the diner within minutes, the building still scarred from the fire plywood covering the burned section of the kitchen wall. 2 shadows moved near the back office window, working at the lock with quiet, practiced efficiency. "Hey!" Cole's shout cut through the night, and the shadows froze before scrambling toward a car parked at the edge of the lot. Cole ran toward them, catching sight of a face illuminated briefly by a streetlight. Dale's own partner, a young deputy named Riggins, someone Cole recognized from the fire scene days earlier. "Grayson's men," Cole said grimly to Big Russ as the car peeled away into the darkness. "They're trying to get to something in that office. Probably worried about records, receipts, anything that might corroborate the timeline of complaints Linda's been filing." "You think Grayson sent them?" "I think Grayson's getting desperate," Cole said. "Which means we're closer to the truth than he's comfortable with." He called Linda immediately, waking her from a restless sleep, to explain what had happened, and within the hour, additional club members were stationed around both the diner and the Blake residence, watching through the remaining hours of darkness with grim, unwavering vigilance. The next morning, as Hannah sat at the kitchen table nursing a cup of tea, still healing, but stronger now, more resolved, Patricia arrived with news that made the entire room go still. "I found something," she said, laying a folder on the table. "Financial records, public filings mostly cross-referenced against county contracts. Victor Grayson's brother-in-law owns a construction company that's received nearly every county contract for the past 12 years, always through no-bid processes his office happens to oversee. There's also an odd pattern of evidence going missing in cases involving certain families in this town, always families connected to Grayson's inner circle." Hannah stared at the documents, her heart pounding. "So this isn't just about me. This isn't just about Ethan." No, Patricia said quietly. I think what happened to you is just the visible edge of something much bigger. Something this town has been quietly enabling for years because nobody had the courage or the protection to challenge it. Cole, standing near the doorway, felt something settle into place in his chest. Not triumph, not yet, but the grim satisfaction of a man watching a long, difficult fight finally begin to turn in the right direction. Then we're not just fighting for a justice for Hannah anymore, he said. We're fighting to bring down everything Victor Grayson's built on the backs of people too scared to speak up. Linda reached across the table and took her daughter's hand, squeezing tightly. Are you ready for what comes next? Hannah looked down at the folder full of evidence, at 3 years of silence, finally beginning to crack into something louder than fear, and for the first time since the night in the rain, she felt something steadier than terror settle into her chest. I've been ready, she said quietly. I just needed someone to believe me first. Outside, the low rumble of motorcycle engines carried through the morning air, steady, constant, a sound that had once seemed like a warning to everyone in Ravenhollow, but had become for the Blake family the sound of protection finally arriving. And across town, in an office with the blinds drawn tight, Victor Grayson stared at a phone call he didn't want to make, knowing that the walls he'd spent 20 years building were beginning piece by piece to come down around him. Victor Grayson didn't make that phone call right away. He sat in his office for nearly 20 minutes staring at the receiver like it might bite him, running calculations in his head that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with survival. 20 years he'd built this, 20 years of favors, traded evidence, buried complaints filed away in drawers that never opened again. He wasn't about to let a bruised teenager and a pack of bikers undo 2 decades of careful work. He finally picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. It's Victor, he said when the line connected. I need you to make some calls, quietly. On the other end, a voice Hannah would never hear, but whose consequences she would soon feel belonged to a man named Harold Vance, a county commissioner whose campaign Victor had personally funded for the last 3 election cycles. Vance didn't ask questions. He never did. That was precisely why Victor trusted him. What do you need? Vance asked. There's a reporter poking around. Patricia Reeves used to work the Billings paper before it folded. She's been talking to people. I need her credibility questioned before she publishes anything. I need her sources to dry up, and I need it done before the end of the week. That's a tall order, Victor. You've managed taller. There was a pause, then a resigned sigh. I'll see what I can do. Victor hung up and stared out his office window at the town he'd controlled for so long it had become an extension of his own body. And for the first time in years, he felt something he wasn't used to feeling. Not fear exactly. He wouldn't allow himself that word. Concern, maybe. A recognition that the ground beneath him, solid for 2 decades, had developed a crack he couldn't quite reach to patch. He didn't know yet that the crack was about to become a canyon. Back at the clubhouse, Patricia arrived early the next morning with a look on her face that told Cole immediately something had shifted. My editor at the paper I used to freelance for called this morning, she said, dropping into a chair at the long table. Said he'd heard I was stirring up trouble in Ravenhollow, and that he'd prefer I hold off on submitting anything until things cooled down. Grayson, Cole said flatly. Almost certainly. Word travels fast when you've got the right people in your pocket. Patricia's jaw tightened. But here's the thing about journalists who've been pushed around by small-town power before it doesn't scare us off. It makes us dig harder. So what's the plan? I'm not going through the paper anymore. I'm going independent. I've got a platform online with a decent following from my investigative work in Billings. When this story's ready, I publish it myself, video and all, and no county commissioner or editor with a grudge can bury it before it reaches people. Hannah, sitting quietly at the end of the table nursing tea that had long since gone cold, felt her stomach twist with a mixture of fear and something that might have been excitement. You mean like on camera me talking about everything? If you're willing, Patricia said gently. I won't pressure you into it. But written articles get buried, disputed, argued over in comment sections by people who never bothered reading past the headline. Video is different. Video is your face, your voice, your truth, and it's much harder for someone like Grayson to spin that into something it isn't. Hannah's hands trembled slightly around her mug. 3 years of trying to disappear, of making herself as small and invisible as possible, and now she was being asked to do the exact opposite, to stand in front of a camera and let the entire world see her bruises and all. I need to think about it, she said quietly. Take all the time you need, Patricia said. This only works if it's your choice. That afternoon, while Hannah wrestled with the weight of that decision, Marcus called Cole's phone in a state of barely controlled panic. You need to warn Dale, Marcus said, his voice shaking. I overheard my dad talking to someone from the department. They know Dale's been talking to people. They're planning to transfer him to some outpost near the Canadian border, effective immediately. Get him out before he can testify. Cole's blood ran cold. This afternoon, I think. Cole called Dale immediately, and the deputy answered on the second ring, his voice already tight with tension. I know, Dale said before Cole could even explain. I just got the call. Effective immediately, no explanation, no discussion. 22 hours from now, I'm supposed to be reporting to a station 400 miles from here. Don't go, Cole said. Cole, if I refuse a direct transfer order, I lose my job. No pension, no severance, nothing. 15 years gone just like that. If you go, Cole said, his voice hard and urgent, you're gone before Patricia can get your statement on record. You disappear into some outpost, and suddenly the one law enforcement witness willing to talk about Grayson's corruption is 400 miles away and conveniently unreachable. You think that's a coincidence? Dale was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had steadied into something resolute. What do you need me to do? Come to the clubhouse. Now, before that transfer order becomes official. Give Patricia your statement today on camera while you're still a deputy with something to lose by lying. Dale arrived within the hour, and Patricia recorded his statement with careful precision. Every detail about the overheard phone call before the fire, about complaints buried at Victor's direct instruction, about a pattern of corruption stretching back years that Dale had participated in through silence and was now determined to help dismantle through testimony. They're going to destroy me for this, Dale said quietly when the recording finished, staring at his own hands like he barely recognized them. Maybe, Cole said, or maybe you just became the reason this whole thing finally falls apart the right way. But Victor Grayson wasn't finished escalating. That evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains and the temperature began its familiar plunge, 3 patrol cars pulled up outside the Blake residence, lights flashing, but sirens silent in a display clearly meant to intimidate rather than inform. Linda stepped outside, Hannah close behind her, both women's hearts pounding, as Sheriff Grayson himself emerged from the lead vehicle, flanked by 2 deputies Hannah didn't recognize. Evening, Linda, Victor said, his voice carrying that same practiced pleasantness that made Hannah's skin crawl. I have a warrant here to search these premises. A warrant for what? Linda demanded. We've received a complaint regarding stolen property, Victor said, unfolding a document with theatrical slowness. Something about restaurant equipment that may have been improperly obtained. Insurance fraud is a serious matter, Linda. That's absurd, Linda said, her voice shaking with fury. I've owned that diner for 12 years. Every piece of equipment in there has receipts. Then you won't mind us confirming that, Victor said smoothly, already motioning his deputies forward. Cole, who had been stationed nearby as part of the club's rotating watch, stepped forward from the shadows, his presence immediately shifting the entire dynamic of the confrontation. That's a legitimate warrant, he asked, examining the document Victor held with a scrutiny that clearly made the sheriff uncomfortable. Signed by Judge Whitmore this afternoon, Victor said. Judge Whitmore, Cole repeated. The same Judge Whitmore who officiated your daughter's wedding last spring. Something flickered across Victor's face, the first genuine crack Hannah had seen in his composure since this had all started. I don't see how that's relevant. I think a judge in your daughter's wedding party signing a search warrant against a family that's actively building a corruption case against you is extremely relevant, Cole said. In fact, I think Patricia Reeves would find that detail fascinating. Victor's eyes narrowed. Are you obstructing a legal search, Mr. Hunter? No, Cole said calmly. I'm documenting it. Every word of this conversation, in fact. He held up his phone, its screen clearly recording. Because something tells me if this search doesn't turn up whatever stolen property you're claiming exists, it's going to look an awful lot like harassment and intimidation against a family that's cooperating with an active investigation into your department. For a long, tense moment, Victor stared at the phone, at Cole's unwavering expression, at the growing number of neighbors who had begun stepping onto their porches to watch the confrontation unfold. Small towns had a way of turning even private crises into public spectacle, And Victor Grayson, for the first time in years, found himself uncomfortably aware of being watched. Search the property. He finally ordered his deputies, his voice tight. The search turned up nothing, of course, because there was nothing to find. The deputies spent 45 minutes going through the Blake residence and what remained of the diner, finding nothing more incriminating than expired coupons in a stack of unpaid bills, while Cole's recorded footage captured every unproductive minute of it. When Victor finally left his deputies trailing behind him in visible discomfort, Linda turned to Cole with tears of frustrated relief in her eyes. "He's trying to bury us in harassment until we give up." "I know," Cole said, "which is exactly why we can't give up." That footage, uploaded to Patricia's platform the following morning under the title, "Small Town Sheriff Uses Fabricated Warrant to Harass Assault Victim's Family," became the first piece of the story to reach the public eye. It spread slowly, at first shared within local Facebook groups, then faster picked up by a regional news aggregator, then faster still, as people outside Raven Hollow began recognizing the shape of a story they'd seen play out in other small towns before: powerful families protecting their own at the expense of the powerless. The comments section filled rapidly, some supportive, some skeptical, a few outright hostile, in the way that anonymous internet crowds often were, but the video's view count climbed steadily throughout the day, and by evening, local news vans had begun appearing on the edges of Raven Hollow, drawn by the scent of a story too juicy to ignore. Victor Grayson watched the video 11 times that night, his fury growing with each replay, understanding with dawning horror that the walls he'd spent so long building that were being dismantled in full public view, one video at a time. "This ends now," he told Ethan that night, pacing his living room while his son sat frozen on the couch watching his father's careful control finally begin to fracture. "This girl has turned this entire situation into a circus, and I will not have my life's work destroyed because you couldn't control your temper in a parking lot. Dad, maybe we should just what?" Victor rounded on him, his composure cracking fully for the first time. "Confess, is that what you're suggesting? Do you have any idea what happens to this family if I go down? Everything I've built, everything you've been handed your entire life, gone, because you couldn't walk away from a girl who spilled coffee on you." Ethan flinched, something shifting behind his eyes. Not quite guilt, not yet, but the first uncomfortable stirring of a conscience that had been suppressed for years under the weight of his father's expectations. "I didn't mean to hit her that hard," he said quietly. I lost it. I've never lost it like that before." "I don't care about her feelings right now," Victor snapped. "I care about survival, ours, and that means we go on the offensive. That reporter, those bikers, that girl and her mother, they think they can expose us. We expose them first. We control the narrative before they do." The following morning, Raven Hollow's local paper, the one publication still fully within Victor's sphere of influence, ran a front-page story questioning Hannah Blake's credibility, citing anonymous sources who claimed she had a history of attention-seeking behavior, and suggesting the entire assault story might be fabricated to extort money from the Grayson family through a lawsuit. Hannah read the article at the clubhouse kitchen table, her hands shaking with a fury she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "They're calling me a liar," she said, her voice cracking, "in print, for everyone to read." "That's exactly what desperate men do," Cole said, sitting down across from her, his own anger carefully controlled but clearly present beneath the surface. "When the truth is closing in, they attack the person telling it. It's the oldest trick in the book, and it usually works because most people don't have the patience to wait for real evidence when a juicy accusation is right there in front of them." "So what do? We let the evidence speak louder than his lies," Cole said. "Patricia's ready to publish the full story. Your testimony, Marcus's account, Dale's statement, the fire marshal's findings, the financial records showing the corruption pattern. Everything together all at once. No more waiting for the perfect moment. Grayson just told us the perfect moment is now, whether we're ready or not." Hannah looked down at the newspaper again, at her own name printed alongside accusations of lying, of seeking attention, of manipulating a system that had in reality failed her at every single turn for 3 years. Something inside her, some final reservoir of fear and hesitation, finally burned away completely. "Let's do it," she said. "The interview, on camera, everything." Patricia arrived within the hour, setting up a simple camera and microphone in a quiet corner of the clubhouse, her expression softening with something like pride as she watched Hannah settle into the chair across from her, spine straight, despite the ache still lingering in her ribs. Whenever you're ready, Patricia said gently. Hannah took a breath, glanced once at her mother standing just outside the camera's frame at Cole, leaning against the doorway with quiet, steady support radiating off him like heat, and began to speak. She told the story from the beginning. The years of bullying that started as small cruelties and escalated into something far more dangerous. The diner incident, the vandalism. Nobody investigated the dead crow, the brick through the window, the parking lot assault that left her bleeding on a gas station floor. Her voice shook at first, then steadied, then grew stronger with every sentence, as though speaking the truth out loud after 3 years of forced silence was itself a kind of healing. They want you to believe I'm lying, Hannah said toward the end, looking directly into the camera lens with an intensity that made even Patricia pause. They want you to believe a 17-year-old girl invented 3 years of abuse for attention or money or whatever story is easiest for them to tell. But I have the bruises. I have witnesses who were too scared to talk until now. I have a mother who watched her business burn down 2 days after standing it up for me. And I have people who owe me nothing who aren't even from this town who stopped to help me on the side of a road when everyone who was supposed to protect me looked the other way. She paused, her eyes glistening but her voice unwavering. I'm not asking you to just believe me. I'm asking you to look at everything, all of it, and decide for yourself whether a town this desperate to silence one girl might be hiding something a lot bigger than one bad night in a parking lot. Patricia stopped recording, and for a moment the room was completely silent, except for Linda's quiet, overwhelmed crying as she rushed forward to hug her daughter. That, Patricia said, her voice thick with emotion she rarely let show, is exactly what this story needed. She published everything that night, the full interview, Marcus's corroborating statement with his face blurred for protection, Dale's on-camera testimony about the corruption he'd witnessed and participated in, the financial documents revealing years of no-bid contracts funneled to Victor's family, and the fire marshal's suppressed findings suggesting the diner fire had been deliberately set. The story exploded. Within 6 hours, it had been shared thousands of times. Within 12 hours, a major national outlet picked it up, running their own version of the story under a headline that read, "Small-town sheriff's corruption exposed after Hell's Angels intervene to protect assault victim." By morning, Raven Hollow's quiet streets were lined with news vans, reporters interviewing anyone willing to speak on camera, the entire fabric of the town's careful silence unraveling in real time. Victor Grayson watched the coverage from his office, his face ashen, his hands trembling with a rage he could no longer contain. His phone rang constantly, reporters seeking comment, county officials distancing themselves rapidly, even Harold Vance calling to inform him, with barely concealed panic, that he could no longer afford to be associated with whatever was happening in Raven Hollow. "You said you'd handle this," Victor snapped into the phone. "I said I'd make some calls," Vance shot back. "I didn't sign up for national news coverage and a corruption investigation." "You're on your own with this one, Victor." The line went dead. Victor sat alone in his office, watching his empire collapse in real time on a laptop screen, and felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years of unchecked power, genuine cold fear. But cornered men rarely surrender quietly, and Victor Grayson was far from finished. That evening, as Hannah and her mother sat in the clubhouse watching the story continue to spread across every platform imaginable, Cole received a call that made his blood run cold. "Cole, it's Marcus." The boy's voice was frantic, barely coherent. "You need to get to my house right now. Ethan's here. He's got a gun, and he's saying crazy stuff, saying his life is over, saying he needs to fix this before it's too late." The line cut off abruptly, and Cole was already moving, grabbing his keys and shouting for Big Russ to follow, his heart hammering with a dread that had nothing to do with corruption charges or public exposure, and everything to do with a teenage boy who had spent his entire life being told consequences didn't apply to him, now facing the terrifying reality that they finally unavoidably did. "Stay here," Cole told Hannah and Linda, his voice sharp with urgency. "Lock the doors. Don't let anyone in who isn't Club." "What's happening?" Hannah asked, fear flooding back into her voice. "I don't know yet," Cole admitted, "but I need to find out before someone gets hurt who doesn't deserve it." He tore out of the clubhouse parking lot, engine roaring into the darkening evening, racing toward Marcus's house with Big Russ close behind both men, fully aware that whatever waited for them there, the story that had already torn one family's carefully constructed lives apart, was about to reach a breaking point neither of them could fully predict. Behind them, back at the clubhouse, Hannah stood at the window watching the taillights disappear into the night, her heart pounding with a fear that felt disturbingly familiar. The fear of waiting to find out just how much worse things could still get before they finally got better. Cole's headlight cut through the darkness as he took the last turn toward Marcus's house. Too fast, tires skidding slightly on loose gravel before catching again. Big Russ was right behind him, engine roaring, both men's minds racing through every possible version of what they might find when they got there. They pulled up to see Marcus standing in his own front yard, hands raised, backing slowly away from the porch where Ethan stood with a pistol hanging loose in his trembling hand, tears streaming down his face, his whole body shaking like a man coming apart at every seam. "Ethan!" Cole shouted, swinging off his bike but keeping his distance, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Ethan, look at me. Put the gun down." Ethan's eyes were wild, red-rimmed, darting between Cole and Marcus, like a cornered animal that no longer recognized the difference between threat and rescue. "This is your fault," he said, his voice cracking. "All of it. You and that girl and that reporter, you destroyed my family. My dad's going to prison because of you." "Your dad's going to prison because of what your dad did," Cole said, keeping his voice low and even, the same careful tone he'd used with Hannah on that rain-soaked night weeks ago. "Not because of me, not because of Hannah. Put the gun down, Ethan, before this becomes something you can't take back." "I already can't take it back." Ethan's voice broke into something raw and desperate. "I hit her. I actually hit her, and I keep seeing it over and over, and I don't even recognize myself anymore. My whole life, everyone told me I could do whatever I wanted, and nothing would happen. Nothing was ever supposed to happen. But something did happen," Cole said. "And now you get to decide what happens next. You can put that gun down and start being a person who actually takes responsibility for what he did. Or you can make tonight so much worse than it already is for you, for Marcus, for your family. Which one do you want, Ethan? Because right now, you're the only one who gets to choose." For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. Marcus stood, frozen sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cold night air. Big Russ had positioned himself slightly to the side, ready to move if things went wrong, his massive frame tense with barely restrained readiness. Then Ethan's shoulders collapsed, the gun slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the porch steps, and he crumpled down after it, sobbing in a way that sounded nothing like the confident, cruel boy who had terrorized Hannah for 3 years. He sounded in that moment exactly like what he was, a scared kid who had finally run out of places to hide from the consequences of his own choices. Cole moved forward carefully, kicking the gun further away before crouching down in front of Ethan, his expression unreadable. "You're going to call the police," Cole said. "Not your dad's people. State police. You're going to tell them everything, what you did to Hannah, what you know about your father's corruption, all of it. And you're going to do it before your father finds a way to make you disappear into his version of events instead of your own." "He'll never forgive me," Ethan whispered. "Maybe not," Cole said, "but at least you'll finally be telling the truth." The state police arrived 20 minutes later, having already been contacted separately by both Marcus's terrified mother and Big Russ, and Ethan Grayson was taken into custody without incident. His confession beginning that same night in an interview room 40 miles outside Raven Hollow, deliberately chosen to be beyond his father's immediate reach. Word of the incident reached Victor within the hour, and something inside him, some final desperate hope that this could still be controlled, still be buried, still be spun into a version of events that protected his family and his kingdom, finally shattered completely. He arrived at the state police station just past midnight, demanding to see his son, his voice carrying the same commanding authority that had worked for 20 years in Raven Hollow, but meant absolutely nothing to officers who had no history with him, no debts, owed no fear of his influence. "Your son has requested an attorney and has begun cooperating with our investigation," the desk sergeant told him flatly. "You're welcome to wait, but you won't be permitted to speak with him alone." "I am the sheriff of Raven Hollow County," Victor said, his voice rising with barely controlled fury. "I'm aware," the sergeant said, unmoved. "That's actually part of why this case has been transferred to our jurisdiction, Sheriff. Given the obvious conflict of interest." Victor stood in that fluorescent-lit waiting room for hours, watching his entire world dissolve piece by piece, understanding with growing horror that his own son had become the instrument of his downfall. confessing not just to the assault but to years of covered-up harassment, to his father's explicit instructions to lie about his whereabouts, to overheard conversations about the diner fire that corroborated everything Dale Whitfield had already told Patricia on camera. By morning, the story had transformed entirely. What had begun as a local corruption scandal became something far larger and more damning. A sheriff's son in custody confessing to assault and obstruction, implicating his own father in a cover-up that stretched back years. Patricia published the update within hours of confirming it through her contacts, and the story reignited across every platform with even greater intensity than before. Hannah watched the coverage from the clubhouse kitchen, her emotions a tangled knot she couldn't quite untangle, relief, vindication, and something unexpectedly close to pity for the broken boy who had spent 3 years making her life a living nightmare. "I never wanted this," she said quietly, watching footage of Ethan being led into the police station in handcuffs. "I never wanted him to go to prison. I just wanted him to stop." "I know," Linda said, wrapping an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "But sometimes stopping someone requires more than just asking nicely, baby. Sometimes it requires the whole truth coming out, even when the truth is ugly for everyone involved." Cole, standing near the doorway with his arms crossed, watched the exchange with quiet understanding. "You did the right thing," he said to Hannah. "What happens to Ethan now is a consequence of his own choices and his father's choices, not yours. Don't carry guilt for choices that were never yours to make." But Victor Grayson, even with his son in custody and his empire crumbling in real time, wasn't finished fighting. 2 days later, as the county board scheduled an emergency town hall meeting to address the growing crisis engulfing Raven Hollow's government, Victor began working every remaining connection he had, calling in decades of favors and buried debts, in a last desperate attempt to control the narrative before it could be permanently written without his input. The town hall was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center, and word of it spread through Raven Hollow like wildfire, drawing not just local residents, but reporters from across the state, all converging on a town that had spent decades believing itself too small and too insignificant for anyone outside its borders to ever pay attention to. "You don't have to go," Cole told Hannah the morning of the meeting, watching her hands shake slightly as she buttoned her jacket. "Patricia can present the evidence without you standing up there in front of everyone." "No," Hannah said, her voice steadier than her hands. "I need to be there. I've spent 3 years letting other people control what happens to me. I'm not going to hide during the one moment that actually matters." Linda squeezed her daughter's hand. "Whatever happens in there, I'm proud of you, no matter what." The community center was packed. By the time they arrived, chairs filled well past capacity, people standing along the walls and spilling out into the parking lot, where speakers had been hastily set up to broadcast the meeting to the overflow crowd. Hannah felt every eye in the room turn toward her as she walked in, and for a moment the old instinct to disappear, to make herself small and invisible, threatened to overwhelm her entirely. Cole's hand settled briefly on her shoulder, steady and grounding. "You're not alone in this room," he said quietly. "Remember that." Victor Grayson sat at the front of the room alongside the county board members, his composure carefully reconstructed for public consumption, though the tightness around his eyes betrayed the strain of a man fighting for his very survival. When the meeting began, he wasted no time seizing the narrative. "I understand there's been a great deal of misinformation circulating about my family and my department," he said, his voice carrying the same practiced authority that had controlled this town for 20 years. "I want to address these accusations directly and honestly. My son made a terrible mistake, and he will face the consequences of that mistake through the legal system, as he should. But I want to be very clear that suggestions of widespread corruption within my department are exaggerations fueled by outside agitators." His eyes flicked briefly pointedly toward Cole and the small cluster of Hell's Angels members standing near the back of the room, who have no real stake in this community and no real understanding of the good work this department has done for 2 decades. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some supportive nods from longtime residents who had known Victor for years, some skeptical frowns from those who'd read Patricia's reporting and weren't so easily swayed by practiced rhetoric. "That biker showed up here 2 weeks ago," Victor continued, gesturing toward Cole, "and within days my family's name was being dragged through the mud on the internet by people with no journalistic credentials, no fact-checking process, just a vendetta against law enforcement, dressed up as concern for a troubled young woman who frankly has a documented history of That's a lie. Hannah's voice rang out clearly through the room before she'd even fully decided to speak, cutting through Victor's carefully constructed narrative with a force that surprised even her. Every head in the room turned toward her, and for one terrifying moment, she felt the old fear rush back, the instinct to sit down, to disappear, to let someone else carry this weight. Instead, she stood up. I don't have a documented history of anything except 3 years of complaints this department ignored. She said, her voice shaking but growing steadier with every word. Every single report my mother filed, every single time we called about vandalism, about threats, about a brick through our living room window. All of it ignored because the person responsible for those things was your son, and you made sure nothing ever stuck to him. Young lady, I understand you're upset. I'm not upset, Hannah said, cutting him off with a clarity that seemed to shock even herself. I'm done being scared. Your son already confessed. He's already told the state police everything what he did to me, what you told him to say, what you knew about the fire at my mother's diner. This isn't about outside agitators or internet vendettas. This is about a man who spent 20 years believing he was untouchable, and it turns out he wasn't. The room had gone utterly silent, every person present hanging on the exchange unfolding in front of them. Reporters at the back scrambling to capture every word. Patricia rose from her seat near the front, holding up a tablet. I think this is an appropriate moment to share something I've been holding back, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room's speakers. I obtained this footage yesterday from a security camera across the street from the Blake Diner the same night of the assault in question. She connected her tablet to the community center's projector, and grainy but unmistakable footage flickered onto the wall behind her, time-stamped and dated, showing Ethan and his friends confronting Hannah in the parking lot, showing the assault itself in stark, undeniable detail, showing Hannah collapsing to the pavement while the boys fled into the darkness. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone near the back began recording the projection on their phone. Victor's face had gone the color of ash, his mouth opening and closing without any sound emerging. I want to be clear about something else, Patricia continued, her voice cutting through the shocked murmuring. I've also obtained financial records showing a pattern of no-bid contracts awarded to Sheriff Grayson's brother-in-law over the past 12 years, timed suspiciously alongside a pattern of evidence disappearing in cases involving families connected to the sheriff's inner circle. I have testimony from a 15-year veteran deputy confirming he personally witnessed Sheriff Grayson order the suppression of a criminal investigation into his own son, and I have confirmation from the county fire marshal's office that the fire at the Blake Diner has now been officially reclassified as arson. The room erupted into chaos, voices rising over each other. Some shouting questions, some shouting accusations, the carefully controlled order of the town hall dissolving into something closer to a courtroom drama playing out in real time in front of an audience that had spent decades trusting a man who had betrayed that trust at every possible turn. Victor shot to his feet, his composure completely gone, now his voice rising to a near shout to be heard over the crowd. This is a coordinated attack on this department, orchestrated by outside criminals who don't understand how this town works. How this town works, Hannah repeated, her voice somehow carrying over the chaos, is that people like you get to hurt people like me for years and nobody does anything because everyone's too scared of what happens if they speak up. I'm done being scared, Sheriff Grayson, and judging by this room, I think a lot of other people are done being scared too. A voice near the front of the room called out unexpectedly, an older woman, Hannah vaguely recognized as a longtime resident who ran the town's small hardware store. My nephew reported vandalism to your department 3 years ago, involving your son's friends. Nothing ever happened with that report either. Another voice rose from the crowd, a man Hannah didn't recognize at all. My daughter was harassed by that same group of boys. We were told there wasn't enough evidence to pursue anything. One by one, voices began rising from different corners of the packed room, each one a small crack in the wall of silence Victor Grayson had spent 20 years constructing, each one a story that had been buried, dismissed, or ignored because speaking up against the Grayson family had always seemed more dangerous than staying quiet. Victor stood at the front of the room, surrounded by rising voices that no longer feared him, his kingdom collapsing in real time in front of cameras that would broadcast this moment to the entire country by morning. That was when Deputy Riggins, the same deputy Cole had caught trying to break into the diner's back office weeks earlier, stood up from where he'd been sitting quietly near the exit, his face pale but his voice steady. "I have something to say," Riggins announced, and the room's chaos slowly quieted, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Sheriff Grayson ordered me and another deputy to break into the Blake Diner's office 3 weeks ago, looking for records that might connect his family to the vandalism and fire investigations. I did it because I was scared of losing my job if I refused. I'm not scared anymore. I'm done." Victor's face contorted with fury and disbelief. "You're lying," he snapped. "This is exactly the coordinated smear campaign I've been warning about. I have a text message from you confirming the instruction," Riggins said, holding up his phone with visibly trembling hands. "I saved it because some part of me knew this day might come." The room fell into stunned silence, broken only by the click of camera shutters and the low murmur of reporters already drafting the headlines that would define this story for the rest of the country by morning. Victor Grayson looked around the room at the faces of people he'd controlled and intimidated for 2 decades, at the reporters capturing his downfall in real time, at the girl standing near the front who had refused to disappear no matter how hard he tried to make her, and something inside him, some final desperate reservoir of self-preservation, snapped entirely. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, his voice low and dangerous, directed at Hannah, with a venom that made Cole immediately step forward, positioning himself protectively at her side. "This town belongs to my family. It has for 20 years. You think a bunch of criminals on motorcycles and a washed-up reporter are going to change that?" "It's not us who changed anything," Cole said quietly. "It's you. Everything that's happening right now is happening because of choices you made, not choices we made for you." Victor's eyes were wild now, his composure gone, completely replaced by something raw and dangerous that made several people in the front rows instinctively push their chairs back. "You think this is over? You think exposing me changes anything? I still know this county. I still know things about people in this room that would end careers, end marriages, end lives if I chose to release them." "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" Patricia asked, her recording device still capturing every word. Victor's jaw worked silently for a moment, some final vestige of self-control warring against the fury consuming him. And then in a moment that would replay across national news broadcasts for weeks afterward, he reached beneath his jacket toward his sidearm, his movements erratic and unfocused in a way that made the entire room gasp and scramble backwards simultaneously. "Victor, don't." The voice belonged to Patricia, but it was Cole who moved first, lunging forward to shield Hannah with his own body as chaos erupted through the community center chairs, scraping violently against the floor as people scrambled toward exits, screams tearing through what had been just moments before a town hall meeting about local corruption. A single gunshot cracked through the room, deafening in the enclosed space, and for one horrifying, suspended moment, nobody could tell who had fired it or who it had struck. The sound of the gunshot seemed to hang in the air long after it faded, and for one endless second, nobody in that room moved at all. Then Victor Grayson staggered backward, his own weapon slipping from his fingers and clattering to the floor, a dark stain already spreading across his shoulder. Patricia stood a few feet away, her hand still raised, a small pistol trembling in her grip, the one she'd carried for years, covering dangerous stories in worse places than Raven Hollow, the one she'd hoped she would never actually need to use. "He was aiming at her," Patricia said, her voice shaking but her eyes fixed on Victor as he sank to his knees. "He was aiming right at Hannah." Screams and chaos swallowed the room whole. People scrambled for the exits, chairs overturned, someone shouting for a medic, someone else shouting for the actual police, as if the irony of that particular request wasn't already suffocating in a room that had just watched its sheriff try to shoot a teenage girl in front of 100 witnesses and a dozen cameras. Cole hadn't let go of Hannah, his body still curved protectively around hers, his heart hammering against his ribs as he scanned the chaos for any further threat. "Are you hit? Hannah, look at me. Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," Hannah gasped, her voice barely audible over the noise. I'm okay." Linda pushed through the panicking crowd, sobbing, wrapping her arms around her daughter with a desperation that seemed to physically hold her together. "Oh my God, baby, oh my God." On the floor, Victor Grayson pressed a shaking hand against his bleeding shoulder, his face contorted with pain and disbelief, staring up at the room full of people who had just watched him try to kill a child, rather than face the consequences of his own corruption. "This town belongs to me," he gasped through gritted teeth, blood seeping between his fingers. It always will. You people don't understand what you've done. What we've done, Cole said, straightening slowly, his voice hard as iron, is watch you prove in front of everyone exactly what kind of man you really are. State troopers who had been stationed outside as a precaution, anticipating exactly the kind of volatility this meeting might provoke, flooded into the room within minutes, weapons drawn, quickly assessing the scene and moving to secure Victor, who was still shouting incoherent threats as paramedics arrived to stabilize his wound before placing him under arrest. Victor Grayson, you're under arrest for attempted murder, obstruction of justice, justice, and accessory to arson. The lead trooper announced, reading him his rights as he was loaded onto a stretcher, his career, his reputation, and his family's entire legacy collapsing in the same breath as his physical body. Hannah watched it happen from the safety of Cole's arm, and her mother's embrace, feeling something complicated, settle over her. Not quite triumph, not quite relief, but something closer to the exhausted release of a burden she'd carried alone for far too long, finally set down. It's over, Linda whispered into her daughter's hair. It's finally over. Is it though? Hannah asked quietly, watching Victor being wheeled out of the community center under armed guard. It doesn't feel over. It just feels like it finally stopped. Cole crouched down slightly, meeting her eyes with the same steady patience he'd shown her that first night on the side of the road. Sometimes those are the same thing, Hannah. Sometimes stopping is exactly what over looks like at first. The rest comes later slowly. But you did the hardest part already. You stood up when it would have been so much easier to stay quiet. The days that followed moved in a blur of activity that Hannah could barely process. Federal investigators arrived within 48 hours, drawn by the sheer scale of corruption Patricia's reporting had uncovered, absorbing the case from state authorities and beginning a much broader investigation into Victor Grayson's 20 years of unchecked power. The financial records Patricia had gathered opened into something even larger than anyone had initially realized: evidence of bribery, evidence tampering across dozens of cases, connections to county officials who had quietly protected the Grayson family's interests in exchange for favors that stretched back further than anyone in the department had been willing to admit. Deputy Dale Whitfield's testimony, once considered a career-ending risk, became instrumental in building a case that would ultimately implicate not just Victor, but 3 other county officials who had spent years enabling his corruption in exchange for their own share of the benefits. Ethan, facing his own separate legal proceedings for the assault, continued cooperating fully with investigators, his testimony against his father proving crucial in establishing the pattern of obstruction that had protected him for years. It wouldn't erase what he'd done to Hannah. Nothing could do that, but it was, Hannah realized, watching the case unfold from a careful distance, the first honest thing Ethan Grayson had done in longer than she could remember. Marcus, too, continued speaking with investigators, his initial fear giving way to something like relief once the truth was finally out in the open. Once he no longer had to carry the weight of a secret that had been eating away at him since that rainy parking lot night weeks earlier. Patricia's story, meanwhile, had transformed from a small-town expose into a national conversation about corruption and rural law enforcement, about the particular vulnerability of towns too small and too isolated for anyone outside to pay attention until something exploded loud enough to be impossible to ignore. Major networks reached out for interviews. A true crime podcast requested access to the case files. Patricia turned most of it down, protective of Hannah's privacy in a way that surprised even herself, though she did agree to a handful of carefully chosen interviews that kept the pressure on federal investigators to see the case through to its conclusion. Hannah herself avoided most of the media attention, retreating instead into the quiet, steady rhythm of healing that came with finally truly being safe. She spent her days at the clubhouse in those early weeks, surrounded by people who had become, in the strangest and most unexpected way, something like family. Doreen checking on her injuries with grandmotherly fussing, Big Russ teaching her card games she'd never had time to learn. Cole simply being present in a way that asked nothing of her except that she keep healing at her own pace. "Can I ask you something?" Hannah said one evening, sitting across from Cole at the long clubhouse table, while the others filtered in and out around them. "Anything," Cole said. "Why did you actually stop that night at the gas station? You didn't know me. You had no reason to get involved in any of this." Cole was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing absent patterns on the worn wooden table. "When I was about your age," he finally said, "I had a stepfather who hurt me pretty badly. Nobody stopped for me. Not teachers, not neighbors, not a single adult who probably suspected something was wrong, but decided it wasn't their business to get involved. I promised myself a long time ago that if I ever had the power to be the person who stopped, I would be. Every single time, no exceptions. Hannah felt her throat tighten. I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm not looking for sympathy, Cole said gently. I'm telling you because I want you to understand something important. What happened to you wasn't random, and it wasn't your fault, and the reason I stopped wasn't charity. It was recognition. I saw someone who needed exactly what nobody gave me. That's all it ever was. Hannah reached across the table and squeezed his hand, and for a moment neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed to be said. The diner, meanwhile, began the slow process of rebuilding. Insurance money finally released after the arson investigation confirmed what everyone had already suspected, combined with an outpouring of community support that surprised Linda more than anything else that had happened over the past several months. Neighbors who had stayed silent during the darkest days of the harassment now showed up with donations with volunteer labor, with apologies that came too late to undo the damage, but early enough to mean something for whatever came next. I should have said something sooner, the hardware store owner told Linda one afternoon helping unload lumber for the diner's reconstruction. I saw things. I heard things. I told myself it wasn't my place to get involved. You're here now, Linda said simply. That counts for something. Slowly, painstakingly, the diner rose from its ashes over the following months, rebuilt not just with wood and drywall, but with something intangible that Linda would later describe as an entirely different feeling than the place had ever held before, a sense of community that had been buried under decades of fear finally allowed to surface. 2 months after the town hall confrontation, federal prosecutors formally charged Victor Grayson with attempted murder, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, and a litany of corruption charges that would ultimately keep him facing trial for years to come. His shoulder healed enough for him to stand for arraignment, though the man who appeared in that courtroom bore little resemblance to the commanding sheriff who had ruled Raven Hollow for 2 decades, smaller, somehow diminished, stripped of the authority that had always been the true source of his power. Hannah attended the arraignment sitting in the gallery beside her mother and Cole, watching Victor Grayson enter a plea of not guilty despite overwhelming evidence, watching him refuse even facing the full weight of federal charges, to acknowledge what he'd done to her or to the countless other families his corruption had quietly harmed over the years. He's never going to admit it, Hannah said quietly as they left the courthouse. Not really, not the way that actually means something. Maybe not, Cole said. But you don't need his admission to know the truth. You already know it. So does everyone who watched that footage, who read Patricia's reporting, who heard those other voices standing up in that town hall meeting. His admission was never going to be the thing that gave you peace, Hannah. You already found that on your own. She thought about that for a long time afterward. The idea that peace wasn't something Victor Grayson could give her or withhold from her, that it had never actually belonged to him at all, that it was something she'd been slowly, painfully building for herself since the moment she'd chosen to whisper Ethan's name into the rain outside a gas station weeks ago. The reopening of the diner became something of an event in Raven Hollow, word spreading quickly through a town still processing the seismic shift that had upended 2 decades of assumed order. Linda had worried nobody would come, that the association with scandal and violence might scare away the customers who had once filled her booths, but instead the opposite proved true. The diner was packed from the moment the doors opened, filled not just with longtime regulars, but with strangers who had followed the story online, who wanted to see for themselves the small business that had become almost accidentally a symbol of resistance against corruption that had gone unchecked for far too long. Hannah worked the counter that day just as she had for years before everything changed, except now something fundamental was different in the way people looked at her. Gone was the careful avoidance, the studied indifference that had defined her presence in this town for 3 years. In its place was something that looked almost like respect, mixed with the particular curiosity small towns reserve for people who had unexpectedly become part of a story bigger than themselves. "You're the girl from the news," a woman said, approaching the counter with 2 young children in tow. The one who stood up to the sheriff. "I guess I am," Hannah said, feeling a flush of something unfamiliar rise in her chest, not quite pride, but adjacent to it. "My daughter's about your age," the woman continued, glancing down at one of the children beside her. "She's dealing with something similar at her school." Not this bad, but similar. I showed her your interview. I wanted her to see that speaking up actually matters, that it can actually change something. Hannah felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. Tell her it's scary, she said quietly. Tell her it doesn't feel brave while you're doing it. It just feels terrifying, and it's okay if it feels terrifying because you can still do it anyway. The woman nodded, tears glistening briefly in her eyes before she thanked Hannah and moved toward an open booth, and Hannah stood there for a moment processing the strange, unexpected weight of what had just happened. The realization that her worst experience, the thing that had nearly broken her completely, had somehow become something that might help another scared kid somewhere find the courage to speak up too. Cole watched the exchange from near the door, a small, proud smile tugging at the corner of his mouth that he didn't bother hiding when Hannah caught his eye. You okay? He asked as she passed by with a tray of coffee refills. I think so, Hannah said, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she actually meant it. That evening, after the diner had closed and the last of the celebratory crowd had finally dispersed, Hannah sat outside on the diner's newly rebuilt back steps with Cole, the same steps where a dead crow had once been left as a warning, now simply steps again, ordinary and unremarkable in the best possible way. What happens now? Hannah asked, looking out at the quiet street, at a town that was slowly and perfectly beginning to heal from decades of silence it hadn't even fully realized it was suffering under. I mean for you, for the club, now that this is basically over. We ride on to wherever we're needed next, I suppose, Cole said, though something in his voice suggested he wasn't in any particular hurry to leave Raven Hollow just yet. But that doesn't mean this ends, Hannah. You've got my number. You've got Doreen's, Big Russ's, everyone's. If you ever need anything, and I mean anything, you call, and someone will be there. That's not an empty promise. That's how this works. I don't know how to thank you, Hannah said, for any of it, for stopping that night, for everything since. You don't need to thank me, Cole said, echoing words Doreen had spoken to her weeks earlier, words that felt truer now than they had then. You did the hard part yourself. I just made sure you didn't have to do it alone. Hannah looked out at the street at the town that had once felt like a prison, built entirely of silence and fear, and found to her quiet astonishment that it no longer felt that way. It felt for the first time in 3 years like somewhere she might actually choose to stay, not because she had no other options, but because this place, flawed and healing and imperfect as it was, had finally become somewhere worth fighting for. You stood up when nobody else would, Cole said quietly, echoing the words he would say to her many more times over the years, that followed words that would become something like a mantra for the person she was determined to become. That's enough, Hannah. That's more than enough. That's everything. 6 months later, Sheriff Victor Grayson was convicted on all major charges, sentenced to decades in federal prison for corruption that had poisoned Raven Hollow for 20 years, his once untouchable kingdom, reduced finally and permanently to nothing more than a cautionary tale. Ethan's sentence separately for the assault began a path toward accountability that would take years to fully walk. His cooperation with investigators, the first genuine step in becoming someone entirely different from the boy who had once believed consequences were something that only happened to other people. Hannah Blake graduated high school the following spring, standing at a podium in front of a town that had once tried to erase her, delivering a graduation speech about resilience and truth that left barely a dry eye in the auditorium. She spoke of silence and the cost of silence and the particular courage it takes to break it, even when your voice shakes, even when you're terrified, even when everyone around you seems determined to convince you that staying quiet is safer than telling the truth. She spoke, too, of a stranger on a motorcycle who had knelt beside her in the rain and asked a single question that changed the entire course of her life, not because the question itself was extraordinary, but because for the first time in 3 years, someone had actually stayed to hear the answer. Raven Hollow was never the same town it had been before that rainy night on Route 9. It became instead something better, imperfect, still healing, still but no longer willing to look away from the things that needed to be seen. The diner thrived, a living symbol of a family that had refused to be erased. Deputy Dale Whitfield, promoted under new leadership that finally reflected the values the department was always supposed to represent, spent the rest of his career making sure no complaint ever again disappeared into a drawer, no matter whose name was attached to it. And Hannah Blake, once the invisible girl nobody bothered to protect, became something entirely different, not a victim anymore, not defined by 3 years of suffering that had nearly broken her, but the girl who had survived a town that tried to erase her and in surviving had changed it forever. She stood behind the counter of her mother's rebuilt diner most afternoons, still pouring coffee, wiping down tables, living an ordinary life that no longer felt fragile or borrowed. But every once in a while, when the bell above the door jingled and she looked up, expecting a customer, she thought instead of a stranger in leather who had once knelt beside her in the rain and refused to walk away. She thought of that question, the one that had started everything, who did this to you? And she understood now more clearly than she ever could have back then that the real question underneath it had never really been about assigning blame. It had been about refusing finally and completely to let her suffer in silence any longer. That question had saved her life. And in the years that followed, whenever she found herself doubting whether one voice could ever truly matter against an entire system built to protect the powerful, she remembered. Raven Hollow remembered the town that had finally found the courage to speak and knew without a single shadow of doubt that it always could.